Mungkin bisa buka PowerPoint saya. Untuk beginning, saya mengucapkan terima kasih atas Dr. Kiki Sutisnaki dan de Dean of ITB untuk inviting me. Kiki dan teman-teman di Sivas ITB, Unpar, ICOMOS, Telkom University, untuk all the work they put in the symposium and gatherings that follow in the coming 2 weeks. En untuk kerjasama dalam proyek yang sangat menarik, saya memang sangat gembira bisa kerjasama. Dan juga saya terima kasih atas ITB untuk hosting this symposium. Dan seperti biasa saya berubah sedikit judul saya. Tapi ya. So this is a prologue. Care and destruction are intimately related. An anecdote can show us how. In the mid-1930s, at Mount Penanggungan in East Java, 2 colonial archaeologists, following traces of ancient civilizational stone structures, got terribly annoyed by competing destructive activities on the sites they aimed to excavate. Migrant land cultivators from Madura were planting lantoro and pepper, and thus, so the archaeologists thought, destroying the ancient structures they were to redeem and study. The same archaeologists were, however, happy about forest fires erupting on the mountain. These fires had been man-ignited, aimed to prepare new land cultivation. But to the archaeologists, the forest fires that we now deem as agents of environmental destruction were a boon, for they also cleared extensive tracts of knife-sharp mountain reed, or glaga, and the fire thus enabled them to continue their heroic archaeological explorations. Still today, archaeologists working on Penanggungan see fires as a blessing, serving groundbreaking findings. Next slide. So there are many apparent conflicts at work in this example between care and destruction, care and violence, nature and culture. Yet, we can also see how these phenomena are entangled. This entanglement between nature, culture, and between care and destruction is central in my lecture today. In the lecture, situated between the critical study of heritage formation and environmental concerns, I will explore how ethics and practices of care across the nature-culture divides relate to destruction and violence, and I will reflect upon their societal environmental impacts. It builds on new preliminary research and thinking on a new research project, which partly developed in the context of the SOAS co-op project I joined in the past 2.5 years, and to which I owe immense learning and inspiration. The question driving this lecture is, what do we win when we study heritage across the nature-culture divide and include nature and more than human actors in our analysis of cultural heritage politics and vice versa? How to do this? What do histories of heritage practices across the nature-culture divide imply for moralities and practice and ethics of care towards the world we live in? With these questions, I hope to contribute to the ongoing discussion in this project, and in particular, the workshop we will have the coming 2 weeks. How to address this problem of care, destruction, and violence across the nature-culture divides as scholars, artists, students, activists. What might we learn from each other and from nature and the more than human agents shaping these histories too? Natural landscapes, we know, are never only nature, nor are the cultural constructs central in this lecture merely human-made. On the contrary, a running theme in this lecture is how nature, in the guise of water, rocks, trees, lichen, fungi, mosses, defines, makes, and changes culture. I think I have a slide here. I'm not sure. Would there be temples? I think it's okay. Would there be temples, hermit caves, and a sacred fountain at Mount Penanganan if it had no rivers running down? So to me, this raises at least two questions. First, already said, what might we learn, inspired by scholars like Donna Haraway and Anna Tsing, from decentering humans and following the perspectives and activities of more than humans in practices of care and destruction across this nature-culture divide? Second, what might be the limits of such an approach? As scholars like Yves Zoeker and Grace Lexana have shown, and Martijn Eickhoff and I also discussed in our book on heritage politics in Indonesia, memories and moralities of violence, of colonial and post-colonial times, sit there. They sit in natural landscapes and in the material remains of human pasts. This violence we cannot see immediately when we look at natural landscapes, a mountain, a temple, or statues. But there are always traces that we may understand when we dig further. How to retrieve and how to address these. Heritage, as we know, is political, nothing but a choice by certain people for certain objects to be preserved for the future and to legitimize certain situations in the present. Ongoing debates on decolonizing academia and heritage institutions do not help us to break away from this. While scholarly productive and contributing to undo past injustice in various forms, including the restitution practices, they tend to contribute to the reification of essentializing notions of ownership, identity, and victimhood. They help supporting authorized heritage discourse and professionalization heritage formation, care, which tends towards polishing away difficult histories and multiple forms and memories of violence, again, of colonial and post-colonial times. Engaging with more recent decolonizing approaches, entering now also conservation studies, I pledge for unsettling and disrupting histories and practices of care in this professionalizing world of heritage formation by including the perspective of nature. I argue that while we have to understand better how nature and culture shape and destroy each other, we cannot do without the stories and memories of violence. I will discuss this by taking you to 3 histories of care that may unsettle the way we tend to look at heritage formation. I will do so by changing perspectives from objects to humans to more than humans and back. The histories evolve around the perspective of slides, a mountain, a temple, and an uncountable number of lichen, fungi, and mosses. Together, they show how nature, the more than humans, and culture, man, are entangled. By paying attention to the perspective of mountains, stones, lichen, and thus to multi-species relationships, and by learning about the epistemic violence we do ourselves, as scholars, artists, teachers, students, we can detach and unlearn colonial and institutionalized ways of engaging with the material remains of the past and the natural landscapes that hosted them. So let me, can I have the next slide? So back to our 2 archaeologists at Penanganan and their conflicting concerns about destructive land cultivation and to them, blessing forest fires, enabling their research. In a comparable, ironic way, the fate of the Panjit statue here at ITB was sealed through the activities of a coffee planter. Around 1900, while actively appropriating land for capitalist purposes and having the land spaded, this coffee planter encountered the ancient structures that we now know as Candi Zelokilir, and from where the statue derives. Slides, please. We see again many forms of care, destruction, and violence conflicting and entangled in that example towards nature and culture. The spading of the lands for economic exploitation, the appropriation of ancient cultural artifacts. On this followed, as we know, other human acts of taking and carrying away. Yet, there is also care, which begins with an interest in the ancient past and a wish to know what these sculpted stones near the coffee plantation may be about. And this, again, generates politics of archaeology and heritage formation, serving specific local and state-centered interests in colonial and post-colonial times. But then, what would the mountain think of this? When we think about questions of care, the name of our mountain, Penanggungan, is intriguing. The name, a human gift, likely came from the root word tanggung, which means suffering or taking responsibility. The mountain, peculiarly shaped with a high peak resting on four lower mountains, is recognized by scholars as a natural mandala. As we scholars now learn from other scholars, it features in ancient local sources as the god-sent top of India's Mount Mahameru fallen from the sky. According to the 15th century Javanese text Tantu Pangalaran, chunks of this divine debris fell elsewhere on Java too, hence the origins of Java's sacred mountainous landscape. In other earlier sources, Penanggungan was also referred to as pavitra, purifying, sacred. Next to naming, the mountain has been subject to various human and non-human interventions. Hermit caves, shrines, and settlements on its slopes signify human pilgrimage, as we can learn from Lydia Kieven. Potent water pooled at the foot of the mountain, giving rise to Jolotundo, a sacred bathing site. Can I have a slide? All of this we can understand as practices of care. Now, such sources identified as local, text, stones, local lore, as well as the organization of space that Mount Penanggungan has generated do not just come to us like that. Slide, please. The academic study of material traces of care hosted by the mountain, which has developed since the 19th century, has been very much dominated by archaeological research interests and framings. This, while parallel and conflicting local practices and forms of knowledge have developed alongside these interests. These have been both disregarded and absorbed in archaeological knowledge. The history of archaeological research is, moreover, framed by a progressive teleological story of ever-growing data sets to answer questions regarding earlier civilizational settlements. Questions that, intentionally or not, may have served the colonial and post-colonial states and more recently, local identity formation. This teleological push in archaeology may explain also why some archaeologists keep on seeing forest fires as blessings. Yet, a question raised more often too. What is colonial and what is local about the knowledge processes we study? How have they shaped and informed each other? In the now decolonial effort to break through Western-centered scientific framings of history, art history, and archaeology, and to follow local perspectives, there is the risk of essentializing the local. In that decolonial effort, scholars have pointed out how, in Javanese cosmology, mountains are powerful. They are anchors of the universe, causes of destruction, sources of fertility, potency, and divination, and thus objects of fear and care. As I witnessed during a visit at Mount Penanggungan, people honor and seek potent power not only from the sacred man-made sculptured structures, but also from non-sculptured stones that have fallen from the mountain. Their location is defined by where they fall ended. They too are recipients of local empathy or care. And this begins, again, by naming them. Examples of such fallen stones include Batu Gajah, elephant stones, and Batu Ruma in the village of Saloliman. A slide, please. The name of the village itself, comprising the words Selo, stone, and Liman, elephant in Javanese, may be a direct reference to the many elephant stones and past knowledge of the animal that the place harbored. Stones are, as a Juru Kunshi and two local spokesmen from different villages on Penangan explained to me, punden, or sacred spots, or kramat, potent places that demand and receive care. Now, if we locate these stone-centered stories and practices of care, concepts of power, potency, and fear as local, do we not run the risk of Orientalism and of romanticizing and essentializing non-Western or pre-colonial attitudes as spiritual? Moreover, there is little to romanticize. Indeed, mountains are feared, not just worshipped. Local communities cared for them not only through spirituality, but also through work, agriculture, mining, and tourism. There are also stories and memories of more recent violence, for example, of the violent War of Independence and of post-1965 violence sitting in stones and mountains, but that we cannot see at first sight. Why then do we tend to emphasize the spiritual, the peacefulness, when we want to understand local environmental knowledge? Will artificially shifting the perspective from the people to the mountain move us away from this orientalizing, romanticizing tendency? This is an open question. This is a lecture mainly with questions. Next slide, please. Let me now turn to the temple, Borobudur, and an example. Can I have the next slide? On a picture made in 1949 by the French photographer Cartier-Bresson, a Borobudur Buddha statue positioned on one of the higher terraces of the temple watches over the Kadul landscape. Cartier-Bresson, then married to the Javanese dancer Ratna Mohini, was in Java to picture the young independent nation as it just arose from the violent war of independence against the recolonizing Dutch. But Cartier-Bresson also kept an Orientalist eye for the exotic presence, a lot of pictures from Bali and Balinese women, and the exotic past. His photograph of Borobudur is, however, not only about the past. We can see new life too, the life and activities of more than human agents. Moss and lichen cover the part of the face, the back and the arm of the Buddha statue, and comparable signs scatter over the stone wall and stupa. We do not know, but it is tempting to reason that Cartier-Bresson may have appreciated this as decay and beauty. In the language of professionalizing conservation and heritage politics, Borobodur's ongoing changing guides and valuation is a result of human and more than human agents. So, if we stick to Borobudur, we have on the one hand humans, and on the other, earthquakes, lichen, fungi, and mosses. And water, not to forget. Slides, please. As for humans, the loss of the 43 complete Buddha statues and 250 heads gone missing at Borobudur is a clear example of human agency. These reflect acts of individuals who did not see the problem of taking or exchanging, and the complicity also of a local and global art market and art trade. Next slide, please. But professional conservation and care, as part and parcel of heritage politics and state-centered processes of legitimation and international diplomacy, change Borobudur too. as they change how we can value and understand such sites or not. And this shows the epistemic violence of care through human agency too. The Van Erp restoration of Borobudur in the 1910s, or the UNESCO-supported Safe Borobudur campaign of the 1970s and 80s, are essentially violent, as they always exclude other groups' interest in their selectiveness and can help silencing difficult paths. A second, broader category of such agents of change, identified in professional conservation terminology, are natural processes of weathering and these activities of moss, fungi, and lichen. A slide, please. This is a picture from a report of the research made in the context of the Borobudur, Safe Borobudur campaign in the 1970s and 80s. And I will get back to it in the second part of my lecture. But oh no, can you get the slide back? Yes, thank you. No, yes, thank you. These organic spaces are part and parcel of the interventions that make and unmake change cultural heritage. When we think across the nature-culture divides, an interesting set of conflicts and entanglements in care and destruction become visible here. For both lichen and fungi, while destructive in the eyes of professional cultural conservation, are considered healthy for ecological relationships and the environment in natural conservation politics. Take lichen, I quote, "Neither plant nor animal," so I learned from a US-based natural conservation park website, they inform us about the air we breathe. Or fungi. Fungi digesting rocks, as Anna Tsing points out, provide grounds for plants to live. Today, due to professionalizing ethics and practices of heritage politics and conservation developing since late colonial times, both human looting and more than human processes of taking that lead to material change of built structures are predominantly described and seen as a form of decay. Conservation and restoration in that framework serve preventive maintenance and repair, requiring the imagination of the original and authenticity of the cultural objects, and the architectural and art historical authorized heritage expertise as solution that dominates heritage practices. The object of care in that view is vulnerable, with the accompanying conceptual framework of endangerment, disease, and salvatory restoration campaigns. This, for example, to the Belgian biochemist Paul Koremans in 1955, exploring the causes of Borobudur stone's deterioration, detected in groundwater pushing out and pouring in, it was natural to refer to this phenomenon as stone cancer. Or colonial archaeologist Bernard Kempers, the last Dutch head of the Indonesian Archaeological Service, in 1977, compared the Safe Borobudur technological conservation program implemented in the 1970s, and which included partly dismantling the temple with a heart transplant. Next slide, please. So, might we compare this also, for example, to the concept NODA, used 37 times in the conservation report on the Archa at ITB for the dots on the statues. Next slide, please. It means NODA in Theus dictionary means 1, spot, speckle, and blame, and 2, dishonor and shame. So this way of framing and naming material change in terms of disease and shame, and the mechanical solution of heritage practices in terms of medical operations, serve as has been argued in the field of critical heritage studies, the protraction of colonial and state-centered structures of control. Again, they help silencing difficult as well as alternative histories of engagements that make and unmake sites, and that endow them with new lives too. Recently, scholars within conservation studies began questioning this dominant approach in heritage conservation, recognizing first that conservation and restoration always also entails destruction and dissociation. And second, that decay is also a normative label for change. Change that is unescapable if we leave the forces of nature do their labor. And this changing appreciation in conservation studies and the engagement of artists with entangled colonial and environmental histories tallies with critical approaches to the study of heritage formation and histories of science. Can I have the next slide? So let's turn to these natural forces and imagine us following their perspective. We need language to do so we cannot do it. But we try to imagine it. And I start with a quote. Next slide, please. When we glance casually at a museum object in its showcase, we tend to think that the object is inert and that the matter composing it is no longer subject to change. Nothing could be more untrue. It is very much alive. In a sharp, insightful chapter on the UNESCO-supported professionalization and globalizing of technocratic heritage preservation of the 1950s, the architect and art historian Lucia Allais quoted the Belgian expert Paul Koremans, I quoted him before, from The Museum Laboratory, a UNESCO publication, and the chapter on insect pests. Koremans, an art historian, was a leading expert in the biochemical turn in heritage conservation, which UNESCO also implemented in countries with a tropical climate. As one of the international experts herein, he was sent out by UNESCO on a heritage preservation advisory mission to Indonesia in 1962. He took stone samples from Borobudur to test their composition in his laboratory in Brussels. The result of the analysis, the stone was composed of andesites and full of life, as reflected by bacterial and cryptogamic action. Again, to experts like Koremans, such more than human life, visible on and in stones, could only reflect decay and degradation of the human-made cultural objects. Now let's zoom in on this organic life of lichen, fungi, and mosses at Borobudur, how they came to be subjected to conservationist and artist eyes, and with what possible impacts on the way Borobudur may appear to us. I am inspired by the warning of Donna Haraway and others for human exceptionalism in the Anthropocene narrative and for overlooking, quote, the vital roles that non-human species and inanimate actors have always played in shaping environmental and religious landscapes. So, lichen, I return to that quote of the natural, so next slide, please. Neither plant nor animal, lichen inform us about the air we breathe. This biological definition of lichen is situated in natural heritage conservation language. It reflects US environmentalist awareness that lichen have agency in monitoring and keeping this world and its ecological unbalancing. This observation of lichen reflects the notion of interspecies kinship, or entangled or interdependent companionships, as the way of living in this ruined world, as proposed by Haraway and Tsing. Would their call to decenter human species in our historical narratives require us to look differently at those lichen, or fungi and mosses for that matter? And that is different from how they are understood in cultural heritage conservation terms, where they figure as agents of decay. But again, how cultural is cultural heritage? So many other more than human and inanimate perspectives count in the making and unmaking of a temple like Borobudur. Not for nothing, there are always trees, formerly densely forested mountains, water, and stones, many, if not all, sacralized in the neighborhood, explaining and legitimizing the building of the ancient sacred structures in Indonesia and taking over. So where, before they got extinct in Java through colonial extraction and masculinizing hunting, tigers, as environmentalist historian Peter Boomgaard has suggested, may have added to the sacralizing of sites and by their frightening roaming presence fed into local practices of nature protection. These tigers echo the feline figures on the reliefs of Hindu-Buddhist temples as well as Islamic graves on Java, possibly serving as guardians, as art historian Ellen Nyotto has observed. Water and organic lives, detected as main natural cause of Borobodur's decay, provided in the 1940s and 1950s, so in the early independent nation, a particular concern in the Indonesian Republic's conservation politics, thereby inheriting colonial concerns and structures of knowledge. These concerns and archaeologist Sukmono's persistent international call that Borobudur is in danger also triggered the UNESCO-supported Save Borobudur campaign of the 1970s and 80s. This was also this support was also part of the scaling up of UNESCO's technical program. And in that framework, international experts arrived in Indonesia in the 1960s and 70s, like Koremans, leaning heavily on biochemical research. Together with and directed by Indonesian experts, they set out in various expert teams to research the climatic conditions that shaped and changed Borobudur. The research took place in the context of the Indonesian government's Pelita program, Pelita meaning lab, and culminated in so-called Pelita reports providing findings of the various teams. And the research confirmed water, rainwater and groundwater coming from the hill on which Borobudur was built appeared as the main cause of the temple's transformation. It caused humidity and carried along, quote, all kinds of minerals and salts from the core and the stones pouring out. Clearly, Borobudur was full of life. The biochemical research team, co-directed by two microbiologists, the Indonesian Jutono from UGM and the French UNESCO expert Gisèle Hiver, a woman, zoomed in. Like Koremans before them, they sampled weathered stones, studied the physical chemical substances of their surfaces and the biological life they contained. In detail, they described the growth of algae, mosses, lichen, fungi, and bacteria in the stones. Borobudur was full of life, yes, but this organic life counted in their eyes as cause of decay. In the words of Jutono, it had to be combated. Pictures with detailed descriptions in the biochemical Pelita reports show, however, an amount of human care for this organic life that seems in sharp contrast with what drove the experts to combat, expel, and kill them. Slide, please. Back. Yes. Plate 1 shows a Borobudur relief covered and I quote, by growth of lichen musci in association with Nostocaceae, which is in a bacterium, and some of spermatovita, a seeds-producing plant, and plate 3, figuring a stone block, where seepage water is dripping and growth of Nostocaceae is abundant. Also, a spermatophyte grows at the fully weathered part, quotes from the report. Next slide. In another report on stone treatment, dealt with the life of moss on stones. Remarkable scare speaks from all of this. And from all of this. But eventually, the stones and reliefs marked and numbered before they were to be dismantled, were to be cleaned, ideally by natural means, but out of necessity, so the argument went, by chemical, to remove this organic remains. It is precisely these organic lives being killed in the 1970s that show up in a more positive, albeit romanticizing and appropriating gesture in Cartier-Bresson's picture. This positive image, can I have the next slides? Yes. This positive image of the green, mossy Borobudur Buddha statue overlooking the mountains echoes with a poem of 1926 on Borobudur by the Indonesian lyric poet Noto Suroto, musing in Dutch on the white-green cloth of pale mossy stones that Borobudur was wearing. These evocations reflect watchful eyes, perhaps care for nature's forces, imagined as beauty too, in an Orientalist mode. But what did they not see? What do we see when we think we care, and what do we not see? Here I would like to make a comparison. The biochemical experts carefully looked at the organic lives between, in and on the stones of Borobudur, but they did not recognize them other than decay to get rid of. They did not see lives. If we move a bit further in time of the Borobudur restoration project, and we get to the zoning system set up to protect the temple, where the temple in the middle would be saved from people, and other zones were also protected. And this was all set up to protect the temple. In the minds of the designers, this required also the dislocation of some hamlets, dusun, and their inhabitants living nearby the temple in Zone 0. Like the biochemical experts disregarding organic lives, it is as if the zoning experts could not actually see these people, their homes and their markets, other than as agents of deterioration. Next slide. Oh, next slide? Yes. So in my first tentative and unfinished effort to study modern human agency in Borobudur's unmakings and makings, and understand how this may get us out of the essentializing framings of art historical archaeologists, Buddhologists, scholarship, heritage management, I am getting trapped. How to include state-supported violence, whether epistemic or physical, when we explore more than human agency in shaping the fate of man-made cultural objects. How not to become complicit in silencing other alternative histories, difficult histories, underneath cultural heritage formation. As a response to Haraway's and Tsing's warnings for human exceptionalism, not only more than humans are missing out in anthropocentric histories of technological fixing. Slide, please. The Save Borobudur campaign, nota bene, developed across the violent regime changes of 1965 that followed on the prevented communist coup of 30 September 1965. and the army-led suppression of presumed communists and communists nationwide. In the wake of this suppression, Army General Suharto rose as president of the so-called New Order, and this regime was responsible for the repressive campaign that followed the preempted coup, and in which at least 500,000 people were killed and 3 times more were imprisoned. While the UNESCO Borobudur campaign officially kicked off with raising international support in 1968 and came to be inaugurated by President Suharto in 1973, the Indonesian Archaeological Service had already begun preparing the dismantling of the temple under the former regime of President Sukarno in 1963. Slide, please. In the ominous years of 1965 and 1966, works had not been interrupted. The balustrades of the first and second gallery at the northwest side got dismantled. And as we have argued in our book, Sukmono's, Martijn Eikhoff and I, Sukmono's warnings that Borobudur is in danger became an important tool for the subsequent New Order cultural diplomacy that accompanied its new economic policies to open up to the world. The international technical experts who in the UNESCO and bilateral missions in the period 1960s, 1980s set out to explore the biological causes and cures for Borobudur's decay, and zooming in on these smallest species, perhaps because of that focus, that care and expertise, seem to have ignored the political tensions and physical state violence, while on the way supporting heritage politics that legitimized the new regime, silencing its violence. Again, to get back to the inspiring work of Yves Zucker, Grace Lexana, and others, memories and histories of violence sit in landscapes and objects, violence of colonial and post-colonial times. This violence can be silenced, can be polished away precisely through practices of care, conservation, and nature cultural heritage formation. So how to retrieve these, but also how to address these, and how to situate these in more inclusive and compassionate ways that may help us unsettle and disrupt the ossifying practices of care dictated by professional heritage formation and conservation practices. I have some questions for our case, but we have time for that the coming weeks, so I go to my concluding remarks. Next slide, please. So, why should we care? How should we care? And what does care destroy? In this lecture, I have explored problems and politics of care, past and present, across the nature-culture divide, and I try to provide insight into what they imply for our attitudes towards the ecological and multi-species relationship we are part of, and how various forms and moralities of care shaped, legitimized, and destroy what we consider as cultural and natural heritage. I hope to have shown how these artificial constructs of nature and culture are thus actually entangled. I have also asked what practices of care reveal and polish away regarding the memories and legacies of difficult, violent pasts connected to the nature-culture sites we think we care for. This lecture already had a lot of questions, and I also end with questions more than conclusions. Questions that are raised or inspired by other scholars. This slide, yeah. First, not this slide. This is, no, thank you. First, I turn to a question raised by cultural geographer KITLV, writing about conservation, its inherently destructive impacts, and the inevitability of loss, asking, what would be gained if we were to care for the past without pickling it? The question is also how to do that, I would say. So how to deal with the dislocated statues here in Bandung, or the looted and ruined sites at Mount Penanggalan, Prambanan, or Borobudur? A point I made earlier, last year actually, In comparison to the Borobudur Buddha heads captivated in museum cases or depots, aren't the statues here in Bandung not better off? Or were they not better off, as they, for some time, were liberated, free from the polishing, essentializing, authorized heritage discourse that dictates these professionalizing practices of care in the heritagizing world? Here's some thoughts rather than an answer. I think we should go on searching and retrieving the various possibilities and stories objects of heritage formation can tell, and across the nature-culture divide. Stories that will be of care, of pain and loss, of beauty and violence. We should think of ways that guarantees space that enable these stories to be told, and space for whatever kind of comfort such objects can give to people. And we should be aware that in our effort to include and listen to marginalized voices, whether of lichen or dislocated villages, we always also marginalize other perspectives. Second, on these other perspectives, what does it mean to suffer like a mountain in Java? Here I echo the question of American conservationist Aldo Leopold in an essay of 1949 that became extremely influential for the deep ecology movement of the 1970s. When we look at the name given to our mountain, Penanggungan, is it suffering or taking responsibility? I end with a story. During one of two recent brief visits to Gunung Penanggungan, I stayed at the site of a local ecological organization that first set foot there in the 1980s and which was partly supported by the worldwide funds, worldwide WWF, Worldwide Natural Funds. So again, talking what is local and what is global here. During my visit there, I spoke to a staff member who was born in the region. When I asked him, does the mountain have agency? He responded after some thought, the mountain owns nature, not society. Society only knows how to care and destroy, and to enjoy the result of that. This answer reflects the on-site awareness formed by multiple, also environmentalist knowledge regimes, telling us that we cannot expect too much from human agency and care in general or towards nature culture, whether driven by local, colonial, or global knowledge, material greed, or spiritual concerns. And it is thus why imagining the mountain's perspective or taking a site-centered approach might help us if we want to disentangle and understand the idiosyncrasies and politics of nature culture care across colonial and post-colonial times and across multiple knowledge regimes, and help us to try to do better. Hopefully stones, such as the statues here in Bandung, and other stones, sculpted or not, part of built structures or not, that we will contemplate in the coming 2 weeks, can be our guides.
Saya jadi ingat sebetulnya tahun lalu kami berdua perjalanan ke Penanggungan, ke sebuah satu situs selokelir. Saya sepakat sih kalau misalnya riset ini kemudian tahun pertama alih-alih menemukan sesuatu temuan katakanlah atau conclusion ya atau kesimpulan, lebih pada proses unlearning. Memang seperti itu. Jadi hal-hal yang kemudian ditemukan, kompleksitas yang pada akhirnya makin kompleks gitu ya, itu menjadi path atau menjadi jalur, menjadi path trajektoris ya, yang sangat-sangat menarik dalam proyek ini. Jadi kami ingin juga mengundang teman-teman semua untuk memberikan pandangan atau respons apapun. Ada yang mau mulai?
Hi, Marieke. Thanks so much for the great opening lecture because it really opens lots of contradiction that we will try to entangle during this symposium. I'm really interested when you talk about how conservation biochemical, particularly the biochemical process in conservation, sometimes lead to killing life. Um, um, it makes me think about the concept of living heritage. And I think it's also conceptualized in a divide between human and object, right? Like living heritage is defined as intangible knowledge, practice, or human doing culture. So I wonder what is your take on thinking that everything is living heritage, or how do we conceptualize the divide between living heritage and what should we call it? Dead heritage or innate heritage? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is a very interesting question. Yeah, I think my thoughts or observations are changing a bit because when we started doing our research on the politics of heritage in Indonesia in the 2010s, there was still a clear debate in Indonesia or a clear conceptual framework in heritage politics in Indonesia that you have dead monuments and living monuments. For example, old mosques and old temples in Bali are living, but Borobudur is dead, and that's also generated particular kind of heritage politics. But to us, it was clear that Borobudur was not dead. There was so much going on, and it meant so much for Indonesian tourists and international tourists and Buddhist communities, etc. There was Vaisak officially celebrated, so it was a bit strange. But I noticed that in the official framework, it is changing a bit. But then I also found it strange that you had this distinction between intangible heritage and material heritage, whereas in our perception, material heritage is always also intangible because of the various values given to these temples by people, and intangible heritage is always also material. It is very often related to, if it's like dance, you have the clothes and you have the music writing, you have the music instrument. So it's I found that a very weird distinction. But when we did that research, we noticed this language of decay and disease, so that we were there, but and we noticed the technical view on the causes of Borobodur's decay but I was not thinking of, hey, yeah, let's also follow the perspective of the mosses and the lichen, and hey, actually they also indicate that this monument is full of life. It's insights. So yeah, I think in answer to your question, I would plead against this distinction. I would get rid of the notion dead monuments. Yeah, also because, of course, in his professional archaeology and art history, it matters very much when an artifact was built and what it tells about the beliefs at that time, architectural knowledge at that time, etc. And this is all relevant, but these monuments have been meaningful since that time too. And so also in that sense, they are always alive. It's not that they only have a relationship with the time that they were built.
Dan juga boleh aku tambahin dikit ya. Dan juga ya, kalau bicara mengenai tadi living life segala macam, itu juga relasi yang sangat kompleks, karena waktu tahun lalu ke sana juga yang menjadi perhatian adalah kita dalam perspektif kita adalah bahwa situs itu tertimbun sekian lama, sehingga dia sudah terpisah dari kehidupan sekitarnya gitu. Tapi ada beberapa gestur yang kami lihat semacam dupa kecil ya, yang masih ada di sana. Lalu kami bicara dengan juru pelihara kuncen ya, yang selalu berjaga di sana, dan dia bilang bahwa ya ketika ditemukan itu kemudian semacam mengingatkan kembali terhadap komunitas yang hidup di sana bahwa dia sakral, bahwa dia penting dan lain-lain gitu. Jadi saya pikir ini sebuah relasi yang kompleks, tapi dalam kekompleksannya itu uh, apa ya? Iya, menimbulkan knowledge dan lain-lain yang kita juga nggak bisa. Maksudnya we now getting through it and then followed by it and it's okay. Yeah, it's beautiful. Yang lainnya? Oh, apa ya? Pak Yasraf, silakan.
Thank you, Marian, for the very interesting presentation about conservation and its problem and also challenge. I just interested in in trying to relate this problem about conservation with the problem of context. I mean, the past heritage, for example, temple like a Borobudur have a certain context in the past. But if we try to conserve in terms of, as you said before, in terms of political economic of conservation, for example, for tourism, some part of information of the past will be lost in terms of for example, this is the interest of conservation for tourism. I mean, I mean, a lot of conservation in terms of using it for tourism loss of a lot of part of information on the past. I mean, a lot of recontextualization about the past in terms for tourist industry. I mean, how far or how much information of the past which is meaningful in terms of for example, for tourism. As Kiki said before, a lot of human relation in the past, not only temple but also human activities in Borobudur, for example. How can we keep this kind of information for tourist industry, for example? Thank you.
Thank you. That's also a good question. It's a core problem, I think, in his politics of heritage, and also in if we would like to disrupt certain practices, because there are always many contexts that are relevant for in this case, Borobudur is the easiest example. And there's also many histories to tell. And why is it so that in the entangled tourism heritage politics, the thought is dominant that it should be about the temple, the material, and why can we not also tell? Well, indeed, his more extensively than as a story of the history of conservation, but more about what the impact was of all these conservation activities in the area, which is a story tourists would be interested in as well, both local tourists and foreign tourists. So why don't, yeah, so, and yeah, then we come to the problem how to exhibit it, how to display this. And I know it's easier. I write articles and books and I make an exhibition, but there are very creative persons also in this room who would be able to think of an exhibitionary plan that would show that, hey, this temple is about many contexts, many histories. Yeah. Yeah, I think actually also there is more going on. For example, there used to be 2 stones at Borobudur, one commemorating the start of the UNESCO restoration project with the signature of Suharto, and at the backside all the funding partners, and a comparable one at the inauguration of the Selesai. What is it when it? But 3 years ago, there is now a new stone naming all the, at least they try to name all the people who actually worked, who did the research, who worked on cleaning the stones. Yeah, the majority being Indonesian and local. So that is a beginning of showing that it is about much more than a president's signature.
Yeah, to also mitigate. I love to hear how to us start to think our impact of care, after care, and then also this is also related to problem of presentation, the problem of how to deliver these complexities, as not as narration to be digest like directed by the public, by to mitigate ourselves impact, I guess.
I think I should also add, it also in answer to your question, there is what you were saying, that on behalf of tourism, a lot of the context get out of sight. But so what also happens in heritage politics, that's there are signs in buildings where you can see that there have been interventions, archaeological interventions, other kind of interventions that show these, that actually show that we cannot only talk about this temple as if it only has to tell the story of its building history. And yeah, no, I don't know. We can talk about it later, but
Yeah, it happen, I think. Baik, Prof. Kita masih punya waktu kan? Masih ada ya. Saya akan mengundang mungkin satu lagi penanya. Boleh.
Terima kasih. Saya pakai bahasa Indonesia aja karena ada pengalaman riset tahun lalu juga. Perkenalkan, saya Andika dari BRIN. Berapa belas tahun lalu pernah ikut bareng Bu Marieke riset tentang living memory dulu 2010-an. Nah, tadi kan cerita soal heritage as a memory gitu di gunung, di Candi Pananggungan tadi ya. Nah, yang menarik tahun lalu itu saya riset di Aceh, di daerah pesisir barat Aceh. Itu ada 3 kerajaan, itu di Sumoh, di Susoh, di Kuala Batu, dan di Trumon. Nah, itu menarik, Bu. Jadi mereka ada heritage-nya itu tinggalan benteng, dan itu kemudian sekarang itu saling tumpang tindih dengan perkebunan sawit. Nah, jadi saya lagi menulis tentang displaced memory. Jadi bagaimana memori itu udah nggak ada lagi, karena kalau misalnya karena ketika saya datang ke Aceh itu semua apa yang saya pelajari tentang heritage di Jawa, tentang sacred place dan sebagainya itu kayak nggak ada di sana gitu. Karena karena mungkin juga secara kontekstual masyarakatnya juga berbeda ya. Jadi dan itu hanya teronggok gitu aja, terus di sekeliling kebun-kebun sawit, tidak ada lagi yang mengulas itu, dan itu hanya sebagai cerita-cerita rakyat yang saling bertumpuk. Jadi ada cerita soal GAM, ada cerita soal tsunami, ada cerita soal macam-macam setelah periode itu. Jadi ketika ingin menulis tentang narasi heritage-nya itu kayak kita harus mulai dari mana ya? Dan kemudian saya coba untuk mengkaji lewat displaced memory atau the losing memory dari situ, dan bagaimana sebenarnya melihat apa ya, wajah heritage di Aceh itu tidak lagi dengan apa yang saya pelajari tentang candi-candi di Jawa, sejarah kolonial di Jawa, tapi di sini tuh dia punya sejarah yang sangat kaya, sejarah yang besar gitu, tapi itu tidak apa ya, tidak lurus dengan bagaimana mereka melestarikan warisan budayanya. Jadi bagaimana makam itu hanya makam-makam tokoh tertentu aja yang itu dilestarikan gitu, tapi untuk benteng semua itu penjarahan itu sangat sangat masif sekali ketika di sana. Jadi bagaimana sebenarnya juga melihat heritage as memory juga tidak hanya sebagai memori, tapi juga bagaimana itu juga bisa dilihat dalam konteks displays memory of heritage itu tadi. Terima kasih.
Ada pertanyaan ya, tetapi ada refleksi ya. Ini cerita, ya masalah yang sangat menarik juga dan ya close dengan ya kalau mau critical approach to heritage itu sangat contoh yang sangat bagus. Dan ya ini tidak terlalu original, tapi masih kerja paling baik saya kira kalau mengikuti the social biography of these heritage sites itu membuka the possibility untuk cerita mengikuti cerita-cerita dan memory yang beda, yang displaced, yang tapi yang masih ada hubungan dengan situs-situs itu. Yeah, I'm not sure. Ini ada jawab yang we can discuss this further.
Oke, terima kasih Marieke untuk lecture yang selalu menginspirasi. So I've just maybe a quick questions. I was intrigued by one of your concluding remarks that by moving the statue here, they were liberated from authorized heritage discourse that is happening in across Java, including in Penanggungan. But is it though? Because now they are in another hegemonic frameworks in a way that is exotizing traditions within art and pedagogy that like the project's name, which is to imagine modernity through traditions. So in a way, it's moved from one hegemonic frameworks to another kind of hegemonic framework. So maybe it's a matter of, maybe I'm being apologetic here, but maybe it's a matter of us selecting what kind of frameworks that we want to champions, or do you think that we can actually have a way to get out of these frameworks then and think about it in a more complex way? Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, of course, it was a little bit meant a little bit provocative, but I do think two things. I do think because they are in a sort of limbo, they have been in a sort of limbo situation. You can say they are not free. They need interventions from people to get to another place, and maybe they want to be where they come from. But because they are not in a museum and have been some sort of riddle here, that makes them free, I think. But I also think that what we are doing now and what we might be doing at Gunung Penanggungan or when we seriously as scholars start interrogating this and what to do with this, it changes. It definitely, and then I completely agree. But that is the problem of this this kind of study. The moment we start questioning and or researching or whatever, we become part of these politics, even though we. So the point is to always remain aware of that and indeed of our different positions herein. And again, I said it that's we too marginalize other perspectives. Yeah, but I do think so. I somehow I do hope that I really hope that they do not move to a museum. So that's my if that would be a result of this project, I would be very happy.
I'm more than happy that finally the word came out, limbo. Yeah, being in the limbo, I guess that's also kind of liberation. For example, yeah, compared to the museum environment and something like that. But in my perspective, I might say that when people say that, are you archaeology? So what framework do you use? I can use whatever I want. For example, not to not to like sort of like extracting the information, the knowledge from the object. But here, the term free is more like into we can see, we can use methodology in a way that it is possible. So yeah, we open the possibility. So that's kind of freedom, I guess.
Yeah, but of course it's a very anthropocentric perspective on this, I realize, because what do the statues think yeah, of us concluding, hey, this is better for you than a museum. But, yeah.
Kita akan kembali 5 menit saja untuk ke panel kita yang pertama. Jadi terima kasih Marieke.